is Michael Vanderpool in Tbilisi, the capital city of Georgia. Happy birthday to my brother, Jason Vanderpool, July 1st, 2020. I already called him and wished him a happy birthday. He's at Highland Home for Seniors, and him and my mother are doing very well. I talked to somebody, a professional organization yesterday that I've been a member of for a period of time, all the way back from 2007. And they were asking me how my family was doing, and I was happy to tell them that my father's retired from the nursing care business, or the residential care facility business, and but he's approaching 70 years old, and my mother's around the same, although she's still in the nursing care business at Highland Home for Seniors. So I told her that it's pretty phenomenal that at their age they're caring for people, in some cases, younger than themselves, or at least my mother and brother still are. Now my brother, no per se, but he's still working with people that age. So my family's in good health. I'm happy to report that, and I appreciate that person back in the States I was working with yesterday on a software issue as part of a professional organization I've been a member of since 2007. In fact, I had originally signed up to join here in 2006 before leaving Tbilisi to go to Panama. So I'm really happy about that, and thank you very much to actually, it was the Magi Society. It was Magi Betty. So I'll just go ahead and say that it was a nice. They have the best astrology software in the world, and I mean that. I've matched it against the Vedic, the India. In fact, India's best astrologers will tell you, it's written in their book, you have to hand calculate. Only 10 or 15% of the software on the market will be accurate. And I found that to be the case. The thing with the astrogeometry software is that the placement of the planets is based on the updated ephemeris from NASA. So that's why it's so good, and it's important, because especially with the moon is moving so quickly, it's moving so fast, that if you don't have an accurate calculation on that, and if you don't have an accurate birth time when you're using the moon in astrology, that's critically important. So I found that in comparison even to Astrodites out of Switzerland, which I was told, and I have noticed, it seems to have a bit of an outdated ephemeris. Some of the transits in Western astrology, which there are some that are not recognized or simply not used in what I consider to be the much more scientific, much more modern, but yet also ancient Magi astrology, that's M-A-G-I. Those transits are not as up to date in some circumstances, the start dates and the finish dates, because of the outdated ephemeris. That's just what I've been told, and that's what I've observed in my practice of astrology and working with others in astrology. So many thanks to the Magi Society and the Magi Astrology that is made available to us through the excellent software through the Magi Society. So it was nice to hear back from home, and that's why I'm just saying openly. People do ask about family, my family. Georgian friends here ask, as well as the American friends back home. What I wanted to talk about, though, very quickly, is I was just in a webinar earlier on the Eastern Partnership, which is a 6-nation partnership with Ukraine, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Moldova, and I'm thinking of if I've got them all in there, and excuse me for that, but I know it's Belarus, Moldova, Ukraine, Georgia, Azerbaijan. Trying to think of the 6th one, sorry. But we were just in the webinar, and there were 3 hosts of this webinar about the political situation, or politics, and COVID-19 on the 6 partnership countries. And so there's a lot of problems with COVID-19 right now in the surrounding countries, and one of the first persons to speak was from a woman here in Georgia, a Georgian woman with Reformatics, and I think her name was Amara. But in any case, my question submitted to the panelist or the moderator was answered by her, and she spoke also before that also how that Georgia has on the positive and negative aspects in general, because it was a discussion that involved the question about politics and COVID-19 on the 6 Eastern Partnership countries, or the 6 countries of the Eastern Partnership. And so she mentioned that one of the successes here, because Georgia not only is the most successful with COVID-19 in the region, in terms of the countries surrounding, that includes especially Russia. That's significant in the fact that one of the I don't remember if it was a politician. I don't remember if it was a state official or a member of Duma. In any case, it was someone out of Russia stating that Georgia was kind of like, the word used was kind of like derogatory in the terms of like not being able to do stuff, or being kind of incapable of doing something or whatever, when in fact most of the time I've seen in these last years the Georgians sports and their sports teams, their sportsmen win against Russia, and also in martial arts quite often. And in addition to that, they have not only handled the situation with COVID-19, as far as I can tell personally, and talking to friends here too, I've tried to determine if there has been some sort of deception or non-reporting of deaths or numbers of positive infection rates of COVID-19, and I have not been able to find anybody in my contacts or my friends that I have talked to and asked this question. I have not been able to determine that that there's been a deception. On my personal level, I've not been able to determine that. So they have not only superseded the region in handling the COVID-19, the global pandemic and that medical emergency, but they have also been one of the top group of countries in the world to handle it in an excellent way. And also, positively speaking, Benzina Ivanishvili did make the news for being one of the top per capita billionaire donors in the world to fight the cause, money donated himself to fight the cause of, finding a cure or battling against COVID-19. In addition to that, I had talked to a medical student friend earlier, and she laughed when I told her this, and I asked her this question, and she said, well, they knew about it early. And she laughed. And you'd have to know a little bit about our communication with each other. I have many times predicted, using astrology, future events, and before they actually happen, and later confirmed by, credible news sources. And that's a gift and a specialty and a developed skill of mine. And I had forewarned that Georgia, in the period from February 6th through mid-May of this year, 2020, that it would be one of the most critical times, not only to Georgia, and we call it a heartbreak astrology transit on the nation in using Magi astrology from the Magi Society. So that's what was in the astrology chart on the country of Georgia. So I had been previously invited, but had never made it except for one previous webinar on the Eastern Partnership and the 6 nations involved with that. There was an actual conference here. I was actually over there, but I just couldn't get, to speak enough English to get the people. I was right in the area, but just couldn't figure out where to get in time, and I just didn't make it in. But had I went in there, and because it was on the security topic, security issues, I would have clearly told them about what I had wrote, which is that has already now come to pass. And I stated very specifically, the first time I wrote the astrology heads up was September 1st, 2018 on Georgia for that period of time, exactly in September. I'm not sorry, I mean it was for this period of time covering February 6th to mid-May 2020. So I had later said as early as at least December, like December 12, 2018, around that time, that it was, no, sorry, December 12, 2019, that it was also an issue of regional security. That's exactly what I wrote. That's exactly how I stated it and published it public. So you have a situation where it's now proven true, and it's quite phenomenal, because when I talked to this friend of mine who's a medical student here, she's a brilliant girl, excellent marks, she's super intelligent, which I love intelligent women. And she laughed, and I had the impression as well, because we knew about it early, and I had really encouraged them when I saw that they were debating openly about whether to close flights down from China. I had already been not only aware of the astrology on the country and stated that it would be an issue of not only regional security, but perhaps one of the most critical issues or times in Georgia's national history. And it's turned out to be true, because they did close flights down among the earliest in the entire area and out of Europe. They were the first ones to move, along with Azerbaijan, on closing flights from China, of course, which is where the current global pandemic originated from. And not only did I have knowledge about the astrology, which this Georgian was, I think, partly maybe laughing about the fact that they knew early. Yeah, they had been warned. I had been one of the ones, maybe the only, in terms of the earliest to warn them about that time. So they moved early, and what was brought up on the webinar by the woman presenting on the panel from Reformatics is that what's also critical, and what we see failing amongst the Americans, my fellow Americans, the United States, I'm a citizen of the United States, what the Georgians did differently is the people and the government, they did, even in her words, a pretty strict lockdown, and they acted early, and most everyone complied with the stay-at-home orders, the quarantine orders, and so on. There was a lot of compliance, and the Georgian people worked with the Georgian government. And I'll say another additional factor, not only did they know early, and I was one of the people to come out and say, you know, as far back as a year and a half ahead of time, about this being very, very critical time that was just passed here in May, as far as the astrology is concerned, on this country. And the whole year that returns in a more harsh way in 2022, by the way, on the country of Georgia. But they also took action early. So the people were, and the government both were compliant and working together with, which was mentioned on the webinar. That's a point that she brought up. And the third factor that I want to point out is that there was a 200 United States Centers of Disease Control, or CDC, trained professionals here in Georgia, Georgians that were trained by the CDC. So that shows good investment on the part of America and Georgia in terms of time and whoever funded that and so on, for the CDC professionals to have been on the situation here early on. And so I think a combination of those factors, and it puts Georgia in a place where, again, not only regionally are they supreme in this way, and they've demonstrated that level of capability or excellence in dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, but also they have absolutely, on this point, proven the Russian politician or Duma member that I'd seen earlier this year or last year make a derogatory statement about Georgia in terms of you know, like being incapable of doing this or that or the other. Russia's in a crisis with COVID-19. Azerbaijan is in severe crisis with COVID-19. That came from a statement made on the webinar by Michael, and I believe he was in Brussels, but nonetheless he's European and he was in Europe. I believe he was European, but I think he was in Brussels. I could be wrong on that point, but he made that statement. Azerbaijan is a very serious problem with COVID-19 right now. Ukraine's expert on there, or the person speaking on the Ukraine situation, I think it's moderate as far as the COVID-19, and I think that's what I can remember from that. So it's worthy to note that that's the cooperation and the contribution in terms of the American-Georgian partnership, the American-Georgian strategic partnership, the American-Georgian investment in time and money together for a cause in which, and this has already been pointed out by the U.S. Ambassador Kelly Degnan at the U.S. Embassy Tbilisi and in their news, or on their Twitter. But I wanted to point out my contribution, which my friend who's studying medicine and is with a family that has a medical doctor, I believe, in their family. I don't remember, but nonetheless, she's an excellent, brilliant university student, and she just laughed when she said that. I mean, because she knew. And so anyway, that's just, they had an advance warning, let's say that, and it turned out to be one of the most significant advanced warnings. Although on a previous one, they were afraid of seeing war here. I'll digress from all that, but I just want to point out the 200 United States Centers of Disease Control trained Georgians here. The U.S. Embassy's mentioned the Lugar Laboratory in the positive sense of their being incredibly useful in the situation and so on and so forth. I don't have all those news stories in front of me. Anybody that wants to look that up, they can go there and look at that. On another point, there was another webinar that I had attended previous to that, and there is yet another one coming up in terms of being a new one that I've never attended before, and I may consider that topic's interesting, but it's on the Institute of War and Peace Reporting, IWPR. And I've got notice from them on their webinar as well. So as a journalist, that's pretty active for some involvements this week on webinars of this type. And that's outside of the one coming up later this evening in the United States on U.S. time, which will be early a.m. here, maybe a bit before sunrise. I haven't calculated up the exact time, but I know it's Pacific time, and that is with AMORC, or the Rosicrucians. So I'm going to check the time. So my congratulations to Georgia, my congratulations to the Georgians, because after this webinar, and this is what I said on the webinar, is congratulations for their excellent success, because when I heard the other experts from, Belarus, Moldova, Ukraine, Azerbaijan, and on Georgia, and I think it was on Armenia. I think that's the other country. It's just nightmare in some of those locations with COVID-19, and the politics is really a nightmare. I don't want to get too much into that on the topic of Georgia itself. The woman from Reformatics here on today's webinar that was sponsored by Ukrainian think tank policy out of Brussels, also, or connected with Brussels, I think, if I understood right. Also the Eastern Partnership countries, the 6 countries on that, and then the DCTFA, I think is the correct, maybe 3DCTFA. Anyway, there is 3 different sponsors or host of this webinar. So, but she covered the politics fairly well, pretty well. I mean, she did very well. I can just again say that it's been pretty horrific. There's had to be quite a bit of involvements with European and American diplomats in trying to work with getting through that whole challenge. And certainly, even before the COVID-19 crisis, it was already a political crisis here. In fact, that's the exact wording that most of the media and diplomats had used, including the Georgians themselves, in translating Georgian to English. It was called a political crisis, and a deepening political crisis that in itself, to my opinion, was a nightmare of another kind, outside of and before the issue of the global pandemic coming into the world scene. Positively speaking, there's been some progress in terms of what has been reported by the U.S. Embassy and other diplomats. I'm not going to speak much on that right now, and that's not something that that I came out to make a video about today. Mainly, I wanted to talk about the webinars that I had attended, especially the one today. On the previous webinar, I think that was Monday, today is Wednesday, and that was very interesting because Luke Coffey, I have filmed before, twice, once on NATO Security Conference, October 2015 here at Holiday Inn Tbilisi. Made reference to his comment on the Black Sea Turkish controller about the Montreux Convention and how that hung up the passage, a bit of a delay, getting, Bush, before Bush decided to come on through with the naval warships, I believe it was Spain and France, with humanitarian aid, and getting here during the August 2008 war, or what another Swiss friend called a Russian special operation of 2008. In either way you want to look at that, I had filmed that discussion between the Black Sea controller, who's Turkish, and his conversation with Luke Coffey, and I brought that up in front of Christina Pushaw when she was giving the lecture at Georgian American University on U.S.-Georgia relations. She works out of Washington, D.C., also here, and Ukraine. She's spent a lot of time over there, so it's just that I want to reiterate the fact that U.S. President Donald Trump has signed an executive order about the censorship of internet platforms and such social media such as Twitter, Facebook, and Google, etc., based on political bias or election campaign and so on. And I have read recent news articles about their censoring specifically conservatives and Republicans, and that's been a problem for me. It actually killed an account during the COVID-19. We were sharing information, news articles, and a bunch of people were marked as spam or spammers, because if you were sharing anything about alternative health, comments, news links, or links to alternative health products, any of that kind of stuff, people were getting marked as spammers all over Facebook. And they blamed that on a glitch in the system and not having enough people in the offices due to the quarantine stay-at-home orders. So they had reduced office staff, but I happen to believe that it was just a cover to try to suppress what they hoped to suppress, which was news of the very big problematic epidemic that was turning into the global pandemic that it is now. So, it's difficult to use a platform like Facebook, but yet it's still being one of the most useful at this time. For example, these webinars that I attended, Luke Coffey's a former U.S. Soldier, Bronze Star. He's with the American Heritage Foundation, and they are conservative. And before that, I had filmed at the International Republican Institute, IRI. They have been on television here for a long while, or some period of time before I filmed there at Ilia State University. And the director presented on that event, and the university students were there as well. And John was the director and encouraging them to, he understands that they can't speak as openly, but it may not feel safe for them, but that they were in a safe space, and encouraging the students to go ahead and speak because they were in that safe space to be able to do so. So it's just really kind of heartbreaking. It's kind of a sick irony that Facebook is engaged in political censorship, especially against conservatives and Republicans, which is being reported. And now being pressured, it's being reported by American multinational corporations or mega corporations such as Coca-Cola for not censoring enough, from a leftist perspective, and they're withdrawing ads or revenue for paying for more ads or whatever to Facebook because they are not censoring more. So you have an American filmmaker, journalist, photographer, events photographer, that for 5 years in a country previous to this on an American Georgian military related or defense related project also filmed on events where those lectures on that topic were given or related events to that topic. And here you have an American corporation that is actively censoring, throttling, shadow banning, shadow blocking my account for sure, but hundreds of other people's accounts. When the whole message from the IRI to the students in that classroom is that, well, this is a safe space for you to speak, because the problem here has been coming out of a ex-Soviet past, coming out from a former Soviet past, coming from a former Stalinistic or Stalin's time. And then you have this outrageous, unethical behavior by American companies like Facebook that Christina Pushov's film. Christina Pushaw is also a conservative. So I had already published films from these conservatives on, from a conservative perspective on U.S.-Georgia relations and the International Republican Institute, IRI, which was already being critically, really criticized by Bidzina Ivanishvili, the head of the political party of the current regime, the current government in power here, the Georgian Dream. So this is the frustrating situation with shadow banning, throttling, and censorship, and the algorithms doing that, and so on, in platforms like Facebook, American multinational corporations like Google working with China on their social credit program, reward punishment program, some call it the B system. Social credit system is pretty oppressive there in China. And you have an American corporation, Google, that has worked with the Chinese Communist government to help censor, oppress, and do the social credit system of reward, punishment, and control on an entire 1 billion population people there in China, as China extends, according to Amnesty International, with its national security law, its restriction of human rights or concerns about that into Hong Kong. Amnesty International has reported on that the last few days at least, I think, in a video and so on. Amnesty International is a British NGO of which I'm a member, or a British charity. They've also got a U.S. office in New York. They advocate human rights. Let me check the time. So it was refreshing to hear about the success that the Georgians have had against the management of the global pandemic here, the COVID-19. But again, I was one of the first people to warn about that specific period of time when it began to become a big concern here. I warned about it in written, published astrological heads up as far back as September 1st, 2018, and mentioning it as an issue of regional security. I remember specifically December 12th, 2019, at least. That's one of the times I had written that about that period of time from February 6th into mid-May 2020. And again, that's why a friend of mine was laughing about that here, I think. She knew about my astrology, about my predictions. She's seen them in her own life, and she's seen actually follows my Facebook. I know she does because I sometimes check who's visiting my Facebook, and she's one of the 30 or 40 people that'll visit a few times a day. And she's, like you said, she's very intelligent, so she can take in a lot of information and has a higher level of understanding. So, in addition to that, a lot of Georgians know this, though, not just you don't have to have an education to know about how accurate my predictions have been if you follow me on Facebook. But again, the Georgian people, it was mentioned in the webinar, working with this Georgian government, the Georgian government doing what they needed to do. But thirdly, not to take any credit from either one of those. But thirdly, I do want to reiterate, because I did not bring it up on the webinar, and that's fine. The fact is that the United States government working with Georgian government and 200 United States Center of Disease Control, or CDC trained professionals here in Georgia, I think also helped with that situation. But none of that could work, as we see with the American example right now, with the example in the United States. None of that could work without the cooperation between the citizens and the government. Because in the United States right now, you have a situation where there might even be a very popular ocean beach that the government has said this needs to stay closed because of the COVID-19 spikes, because of its worldwide resurgence, how it's spreading, and the peaks in certain states in the United States. And the problem in the United States, some of the problems are there's ongoing misinformation, disinformation being intentional tactics to, like for example, in my state, they moved away from the model that the CDC had for diagnostics regarding COVID-19 and the positive tests and how these calculations and how that's done. And so I thought, well, that's great, because they're saying they thought there was some kind of, something that they didn't like about that. And I thought, okay, this is great. But then suddenly all the numbers went down. There's even a week went by in my county back in Missouri, my home city back in Missouri, one of them, where there was virtually no new positives reported. But yet, before they changed from the CDC model, it was increasing. They had reported 4 or 5 deaths. They had reported that some of those were connected with some of those positives or deaths. Either one were either connected with a Walmart worker, for example, because wherever you share air with asymptomatic people or not, if they have COVID-19 and you share air like you will if you go into a building, a cruise ship, a naval ship, because U.S. Navy, out of all the armed services in the United States, is reporting the biggest problem with COVID-19 right now. International flights, so the places in Atlanta, for example, Georgia, or in Michigan, where they were flying people, routing in 11 main entry points in the United States to better screen for COVID-19 from international travelers or travelers coming off international flights into the United States. Those areas became the highest rates of infection. Well, they were taking in the most international travelers in those exact cities. And some others. For example, that happened in Italy. Why did they have the breakout in the worst place where they had to have the military come in, and even the Russian military came in to help them? It was so bad, the numbers of deaths and the amount of dead that happened so quickly, and the ICUs being overrun and overflowing, and the journalists and the doctors describing it as a situation of extreme stress in a warlike scenario, which is how my son, who was previously in New York, Now he's out in the mountains, out in Colorado. But he described when it first broke out in New York, COVID-19, the pandemic, that it was like being in a war zone. He described it exactly in that term, which is how the Italian doctors in northern Italy described it when it broke out there and overwhelmed their ICUs and their medical centers. And they had too many dead to handle. An American woman, in fact, was there with her family and happened to be also from Colorado, but she was spending time there in Italy, and she reported that there was not enough mortuaries, crematorium to handle the dead. We saw the Russian military go in to help them and to even disinfect the nursing homes. We saw the Russian president, thankfully, and still very thankful to the Russian people and Russian government for sending America 60 tons of medical equipment and supplies as a gift to America for the COVID-19 crisis. Although, unfortunately, since then, the Russians have also had to deal with and continue to deal with the COVID-19 crisis in a very problematic way since then, as so many countries are doing at the moment, but especially America. And that's the difference between Georgia and America. In America, they may say, well, we're going to close down this beach, but they don't. The average American, they may suspect that it has something to do with the Trump campaign or that it has to do with the Democrats, so they may say, well, we're not going to accept the science, we're not going to believe it, we're not going to stop doing our life, we don't want the economy wrecked by, for example, we don't want the Democrat states, governors, or the mayors that are Democrat over the cities, that, they're trying to sabotage the economy so that it'll reflect bad on the election coming up for president, and they want Trump to lose. These are kind of statements I'm getting from some people at home. Whereas another set of statements might be that, well, you should wear a mask, you should stay inside, this is not over. Others will say, well, they have an agenda, they're getting money off of each diagnosis of COVID-19, and some believe it's underreported, some believe that it's overreported, and but the difference is that they're very freedom of choice and freedom-minded, and they will, if they want to go out to the beach or to the bar, or if they own the bar or the restaurant, then the American mindset is that I have my U.S. constitutionally protected rights, I have my freedoms, I should be able to do what I want with my business, and that includes going to the beach if I want, that includes risking COVID-19 if I want, and whether I want to believe whether it's a serious issue or a deadly issue as much as they say it is or not, and so on. This is kind of the mentality that a lot of the Americans have. So instead of having, first of all, the correct information without misinformation and without disinformation coming from some of our big businesses, some of our big governments, some of our politicians and stuff, and instead of dealing with their incompetence and their stupidity in most cases, with your own research and your own independent thinking, most Americans accept what is actually disinformation and misinformation based on greed, politics, and religion. And there's a painful lesson to a lot of people that have taken and will continue to take a lot of losses due to that. So when we look at this soberly and say, well, this is not going away, it didn't go away with the heat, it didn't go away with the summer weather. It's something that is, if it is not managed well with social isolation and all countries doing a lockdown like at the same time for the same length of time, for example, if it's not managed, then if it gets out of control, then in the longer term it will do more economic damage and cause a longer protracted bigger problem than if they stuck with the lockdowns when they should have been done earlier and lasted longer. So everybody really wants the same thing. Everybody really wants a good, happy, healthy economy, or at least people that are normal and have a good heart. Not people that are thinking with, you know, political revenge or political competition, for example, in some cases. Or people that are thinking about greed and profit versus, you know, overcoming, you know, a biological weapon that is killing, according to the CDC official numbers. Already we're halfway into a year and it's killed 2 to 9.5 times the people, and that's official deaths from COVID-19 according to CDC numbers, and that's just going by up until this half a year's gone by, right? When annually the deaths from influenza, coming up from 2010 forward, annually they're anywhere from about 12,000 to 61,000 deaths per year annually. So if you do the numbers, and this was a couple of weeks ago I did the numbers, and you're looking at about a 2 to 9.5 times higher rate of death already officially from COVID-19 in the United States according to CDC numbers, which I happen to accept the idea that those numbers are underreported by 1/10. So actually, to get the correct numbers, you take it 10.4 times that to get the correct numbers. And that's actually mentioned in Business Insider article, I think, and maybe more than one news source. So some have said that that's how you get the real numbers, because it's people will say that it's underreported, other people will say that it's overreported, and they've changed the classifications for diagnostics in some situations. They've changed the calculations for test positive in some situations. Like I said, they moved from the CDC model and method of coming up with testing positive to another one there in Missouri, and suddenly all the numbers dropped in my county. The rate of infections reported dropped, everything dropped. But yet we see surges even now, actual real ICU, intensive care units, being overflowed, being over capacity in Florida and Texas, for example. That's just a couple of examples. So that has nothing to do with positive testing. That means the hospitals are ICU units overflowing, and that's the whole huge part of the problem. Is then there won't be medical services available if it requires intensive care unit. That means the whole medical system gets you get blocked, you get overwhelmed. Doctors, nurses, medical workers, medical staffing, they get just overwhelmed. So that's the whole point. Anyway, I'll shut up. This has been talked about, and it's being talked about all over the world. But it was part of the topic of the webinar. I talked about these topics today. But on the previous webinar, when we talked about from the Georgian perspective, sponsored by Geostat, it was the webinar where Luke Coffey did speak along with the President of Georgia coming on and talking about the idea that they thought would be good, and she said she came up with the idea a year previous. And I had said hello to this President Salome Zoriabashvili about 6 weeks ago, right here in this same park. So I had taken a great photo of her on Mercedes-Benz Fashion Week last year in May at the Writer's House in Georgia on the Java Dayasimidze's fashion show. There was a beautiful red dress this model come out on the fashion runway with, and the President of Georgia was sitting right there looking at it, and I happened to be just right next to her, one of her Secret Service men, and another guy on the other side of me that was an aviation designer and also a master photographer, Tumeres Puliashvili, and he works with Scientific Technical Center Delta. They make military weapons and all kinds of interesting military, scientific, technical things. And I knew him from the International Society of Alexander Card Valley events. And so he was on the other side of me, and he's a master photographer, and that's how I've seen him on so many events, especially with ballet dancers and on ballet and opera. Fantastic photographer. So, but she said she'd come up with this idea a year ago about a center of excellence, a NATO center of excellence being put into Batumi. And they kind of talked about it, Luke kind of put it in terms of, you know, getting the NATO flag, another NATO flag here in Georgia in Batumi. And President Salome Zoriabashvili was very much in favor of that, and actually came in the chat and she said, I'm actually the one that came up with that idea a year ago. And she really wanted that idea pushed. So, and that would be an excellent idea. The NATO ships are coming in quite frequently to, I think it's Batumi. I don't know about Poti, but Batumi, I believe. And that is an excellent idea. I mean, that's a really good idea. It makes sense. I mean, they're already, it would just be, there's already a joint training center here, as I understand. Let me check the time. And I've filmed on many, many bases, like, so maybe, I say many. For me it's many, because I never dreamed or planned to film on a military base. But I've filmed events on 7 different military bases. One was in the United States, Whiteman's Air Force Base, because of the Warthogs, which Alexander Kartveli designed, born and raised right here in Tbilisi, Georgia. After he went to France to school a bit, and then he immigrated on into the United States, and that's where he did 39 different military aviation designs, creations, aircraft, military aircraft. And then he went on with a 40th one that would be considered a prototype to the NASA space shuttle. But he was born and raised right here in Tbilisi, and became an American. And the Warthog is still one of our best U.S. Air Force jet fighter aircraft, low, combat support. I mean, the U.S. Army, the combat soldiers, infantry soldiers, they love it because they come in and give them the kind of air support that no other aircraft can or will provide. And it's often referred to as a flying tank. There's a titanium hull. When I was in Scientific Technical Center Delta, I had interviewed Ucha, the general director there, and that's up on YouTube. And I actually saw the titanium hull of the Warthog. You know that song, Titanium? And there's the boy that's got psychic and telekinetic powers, occult powers. That means hidden or suppressed in this context that I'm using it. And the militaries end up after him. They want him. They want to, they consider him either of use or a threat, right? So, and then I like these videos by M83. Well, anyway, that's another story about the psychic kids that are gifted, and their government handlers come in and they try to get them back in the facility, and they're testing and developing their psychic skills and their psychic abilities, and they're also telekinetic abilities. Anyway, back to the song Titanium, which reminds me of this and part of my life, like right now. When I was in that Scientific Technical Center Delta, you could see the titanium hull of one of the jets. So, but that's what the Warthog has. That's Warthog and other military aviation, which came from a guy born and raised right here who happened to be Georgia and one of the best geniuses in the world in terms of military aviation design, aircraft design. So that's pretty fantastic. And there's a hell of a lot of great chess players, world champions in chess from right here as well. Let me check the time. So those are the more pleasant things maybe to talk about, historically speaking, and contributions that are far from today's most recent political crisis that I hope is in process of being resolved. Certainly some positive steps with diplomatic corps from Europe and America being involved with the Georgians on that have hopefully produced results that are more conducive to what the President of Georgia has said in her estimation just yesterday or the day before, after those developments, saying that she believes there will be a peaceful and successful upcoming election here. In any case, I never came here for that stuff. I came over here because I married a girl from Ukraine here in 2006, and I came back in 2010 to get a divorce. She was serving in U.S. Army Airborne, and we'd been separated before that. She went and joined U.S. Army, and then was immediately going on into AIT and went on into U.S. Army Airborne. And then after we got the divorce done, I got it filed here and got somebody to represent her to send over the paperwork and get all that done. And then she told me on the phone, she said, well, I'm going to go ahead and go for U.S. Special Forces. And so she passed the U.S. Special Forces training and ended up serving in U.S. Special Operations. So there's a lot of kids over here playing on this playground. I'll talk a little bit about the Rotary Club one more time, because the playground equipment in my city, some of the greatest, best playground equipment, is got a plaque out there that was financed by the Rotary Club in Marshall, Missouri. They had gotten me to kind of almost join them back in 2016, and what the story was is that they had told me on one meeting that they had hoped that I'd be able to go back to the clubs there in America, back in Missouri, that they had so much money to spend, they didn't know what to spend it on, they couldn't spend it all, and so they have projects that they were hoping to do here, as well as growing their club, people that were successful, aspire to be successful. They wanted to grow their clubs, grow the Rotary Club here, get people involved, people with leadership or success or aspiring either one of those. Also, that they had hoped that I would bring the financing from the club over there to projects over here. That's basically what that was about. And they were really pretty serious about that, of course. And so I'm connected with one woman on Facebook that's, I think, still involved with Rotary. But as I said, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me or to my family. And they have, you know, a big part of the conversations now and then we have in my life. And what kind of sense does it make to be supporting or helping with this country, this society, when at home they were, in certain elements, fighting and working against the family business, or from a couple of different angles. Now, one of those persons was basically neutralized. It was a former judge. He lost his judgeship, and the Georgian MIA had warned me about a group that he was a member of, very serious member of. And then another aspect of it was that it might have been just the crossfire too, like not like within the group, like one group has an agenda that goes this way. They have an interest, their idea, what they wanted to do with my membership was in a different direction than this group over here. And so you end up in the middle of what I call the crossfire. And that's what some Georgians called it, the crossfire. Because you had the very powerful interest, very powerful group, one that wanted me to stay over here, the other one that didn't want me here. And some of them were involved in state government agencies and police or security. And had me, that they were trying to look at me in every angle, every way they could. And I had a friend here tell me that. Her brother's a policeman. Her other family members in the military here, the Secret Services. And so they're working against each other. And I got caught in the middle of it. And they're gunning for and they couldn't figure out how to come after me. So they started coming after those close to me, including here. You know, but then they changed the situation up here. But then what happens is that because, for example, in one situation, the friend got a visit from somebody from Moscow, and this one deal was never talked about again. And then they went and they rented her business out, and then she won't talk about politics anymore almost at all. It's very rare now. she's pretty much, so they had their, you know, their things worked in another way. But over there, you know, things I'd never seen before were beginning to happen. So it's pretty crazy, because it's like, well, why did they come and ask me to help with this project and to take photos on all these events for those previous 5 years, previous to July 31st, 2018, and then some of the same come trying to persecute, trying to sabotage. A lot of it is sabotage. And that's what I was saying in a previous video. You know, there's beautiful plans made by so-and-so that would go over to the Ministry of Defense, and they'd work these things out, and would go to do these things, and then I wouldn't get a notice, or there'd be another hang-up somewhere, a glitch or something, or wouldn't even get an invitation. And then from the beginning, one was being lied to about my yes or no answers. It's the same thing with media access here on some events over the years. You could get the wrong information or not get the information, maybe even act like they don't understand English, or just not get the call back, or not be able to get through to the right office, get the right address. I mean, it was a nightmare in some cases. In some situations, everything went perfect. But a lot of resistance to foreigners anyway, in those cases. But when it comes to the bigger stuff, you know, it's like somebody, it was like two very capable, very intelligent sides working against each other, trying to sabotage. One's trying to make something positive happen, the other one's trying to sabotage that something positive. To the point to where, you know, you couldn't expose your plans to anyone or anything, or put it in anywhere on electronic communication, which is what U.S. President Obama, when it comes to transfer the office of presidency to Donald Trump, they gave one to the other a handwritten letter. That's the only way certain things could be passed from one person to another without certain agencies having access to that information. Now, I'm not saying that I'm that important in all the situations. What I do know is that if I put something on the internet, it can be accessed around the world within seconds. And that may or may not have been of interest. I don't know. What I do know is that they and looking back at some of the things that were done, well, I mean, in one case, couple cases, I was actually threatened with that type of stuff. You know, like, hey, I've got the security guy and he's going to deport you, and then I end up meeting this guy, that's a security guy, and he didn't threaten to deport me, but it was clear that they had access to military level intelligence, or former military police, but I wasn't threatened to be deported by him at all. But you know, it's that type of thing. And on the other hand, you know, the other side of the ocean, being threatened by a low-level state employee, that if I continue to help with the project, then we'll get you under investigation, all that stuff, and having a false report filed against me here by one of their kind of secret police here, MI. It's this kind of stupid situation, go back and forth. It's like, wait a second, we're doing something where I'm educating people through film. If I go on an event and I take a film and I put that up on the internet, that educates that person. That's it. Because maybe I'll reach an audience that's different, unique, or on a platform that is not being viewed by certain people of certain other countries. But now you've got the whole scenario where who knows what Facebook or YouTube or Google or even Twitter or other major, especially American internet tech companies, using either just straight up staff people or other techniques, or even artificial intelligence or algorithms. Who knows what they're up to now? You know, it's always changing, it's always developing. Anyway, I'll stop talking about that. It's an old topic as far as me making a video and speaking about that. But what Rotary Club would have to do is they'd have to, you know, I mean, the community, and it's, I mean, they would have to, you know, they'd have to be over full with business back home to justify the expense and the investment of time and attention to doing what they wanted me to do, because it doesn't make sense for me to come over here and help with this stuff if everything's not working super back home, and I mean super. But instead of it working super, it went for a time, and I'm talking about 2016, and I'm talking about from outside resources. It went backwards. They were trying to work against us. And when I say they, one particular local entity and another person involved in that. But anyway, I'm not going to give any details about that. It's not the kind of thing that I'm going to share information about, especially in a public format or in a public way. And so that's why. But I'm going to mention it because I even had to call the Missouri State Attorney General's office. I had to educate them on what is patients' rights. They had to change an entire system at a department out at a local hospital and so on and so forth, because that's a business that I used to do. That's a business that my family still does, is medical, managing medical care, nursing care. And anyway, looks like a pretty elaborate photography session being set up over there. There's several like ring lights, big ones though. No, those are chairs. But they're still setting up lights. No, I don't know. They'll have to set up lights. There it is. There's the light, and there's the chairs, and there's at least 2 cameras, maybe 3. I can see at least 2 or 3, maybe 4 tripods. And more, there's a reflector light for sure, and another reflector light. So there's 3 reflector lights, at least 2 or 3 tripod cameras. So they're going to do something kind of major. They're probably going to do an interview right there here at the park. Yeah, they got like maybe 4, 5 chairs over there. So let me check the time. So overall, that's nice to see. They come out here, they do photography, beautiful models, photographers. There's been a couple that I've known that'll come out here. Beautiful model, they'll take photographs, do a short film. They'll do TV interviews, TV news interviews here. And right now, like I said, they've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe 4 or 5 of these chairs set up. They're real modern looking, with it like 3 or 4 reflectors or reflector with lights in there, and at least 3, maybe 4 cameras on tripod. Maybe not full-size TV, but modern. If they're small enough to be, they could be TV cameras. But they're going to be about 4 or 5 times larger than the one I'm using, but about a third of the size of an old-style television like camera that they use here, TV camera. So that's what's going on over here. Since the time I've been filming here, there's a kid come by that was with a U.S. flag, shorts on, holding his little brother's hand, and then before that there was a couple other kids that come by and look and see like how this video camera looking in the viewfinder, stuff like that. So I think that's it on these topics. It's just that when you're dealing with the major forces, like secret police or major organizations that were working against each other. Okay, like one side was trying to keep me, wanting to stay back at home, or blocking or sabotaging on that side to that end to try to get me to want to stay there, and another side's trying to get to stay over here to this end. And even within the same international organization, with the same what you would think would be cooperation, when actually they're working at some points against each other. You just get caught up in a crossfire. So that was pretty bad in a sense. That's why I make the videos, because there are certain people that are invested in this plans, because I know there were plans made. I know. That's another reason I make the video, because the only people that know what I say in answer to these project proposals, these proposed plans with these different organizations or whatever, these different groups or whatever, I know from the beginning that some people were lying and going back with the answers that I gave and giving the opposite answer. There was that type of attempted sabotage from the beginning. And that's the original reason of a few reasons why I went back in January 7 of 2014 to U.S. Senator Claire McCaskill's office, was to report exactly that. Say, look, you know, you've got these people working with their government, but yet they're working against me or working against each other. They're one's lying about answers and the other one's trying to figure out who's lying. That's actually what happened from the beginning. So it started from the very beginning, especially on the media access, as I already mentioned. You know, like you'd call over to a major, like American Franchise or some other media event for access or whatever, and then you get the wrong date, the wrong answer, you wouldn't get an answer at all, or you get, it just, the whole thing was screwy. Sometimes it went perfectly, sometimes it was like going up against a brick wall. So that's why I make the video, because that explains to people that may have even been advising some of the people here on the American side. Some were maybe misadvising, some intentionally, some unintentionally. So there you go. With that said, again, family's doing great, and I appreciate those that ask about that, both on the Georgian side and when I talked to somebody on the phone yesterday back in America, as I already mentioned who, what, and that was all about. So family's doing great. As far as travel goes, I've already made an entire video talk about this, and that is to say that the situation continues to change on both sides of the ocean. I've understood now this is the day they should have opened up to international travel, foreign travelers coming back in here. But I've understood in reading some news, I need to confirm this though, so don't double check for yourself if that's a serious issue for you about travel to Georgia. I've understood that they're going to delay foreigners coming back into this country for quite a significant time. If that is correct, if I heard, read, and understood that correctly, some of that is absolutely understandable when you've got neighbors like Russia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, that are raging with positive infections and COVID-19 cases, and that's a problem, and that's in the region. And Iran is just south of here, south of Armenia. Armenia is on the border to the south, and then there's Iran. So it's understandable why that Georgia would want to, and as far as what I read, going to not open the borders to foreign travel into Georgia yet, if I've understood it correctly. Furthermore, on a positive note, because of the success that they've had in managing COVID-19, and that includes the Georgian people, absolutely. Because the whole problem in the United States is the government has given recommendations in some cases and the people will not accept it. They will not go along with it. One example is the beach in one area. I just read before I left, the 4th of July weekend is coming up. It's a major U.S. holiday. Everybody's like, we're going to the beach. Now I read in another news headline, I don't know if it's true. I really don't know if it's true. And news there, when it involves the president, is so questionable from certain sources, and it's so very often false that it's suspect. So, but there was one article that said that all the people from the rally in Oklahoma, for example, the Trump rally, have come up testing positive with COVID-19. I don't know if that's true or not, and I would seriously question that depending on the source of that news. But the point is that it takes both the people and the government in a cooperation of following wise science-based guidelines to manage the pandemic, and also truthful, accurate, scientific information, and people that also have accepted and understood that information to make it work. And at least here in Georgia, for one reason or another, or a combination of reasons, they have had success to the greatest degree that they're in the top handful of countries, I think the top handful of countries in the world as far as managing the COVID-19 global pandemic. And for that reason, they are like number 4 on the list of 15 countries that be allowed to travel back into the European Union or the EU, if I've understood this correctly. So this is new news. On one end, it's very positive in regards to Georgia. On another end, if you're Georgian, it's also very positive. You might consider, if you look at it from the perspective that they are continuing to take precautionary measures to protect the population about, from, the threat of COVID-19. And then on the other hand, it's been delayed as far as when foreign travel will be allowed back into Georgia. If I've understood it right, okay? So then we've got the whole United States side where, our president of the United States has come out and said there will not be lockdowns anymore. They're not going to do that. But then you've got arguments that going on. Some people follow the rules. Some people will not follow the rules. Some people believe it shouldn't be. There's no basis for it. Others believe it should be followed, and that there's a solid scientific basis and a real problem and a real threat to society, and that's why the rules should be followed. So anyway, it takes a cooperation between people and the government, and you would assume, you would think, an understanding of the science. Well, here in Georgia, 1 in 10 of the population are medical doctors. They're trained, educated medical doctors. I have to think that that also had something to do with it, besides acting early and acting quicker than everybody else, which I may have had a little bit of help with that too. I gave the notice, wrote it a year and a half in advance or so before that time came. And secondly, the United States working, or the third thing, again, I'd say working with the United States, 200 trained, U.S. trained, CDC trained professionals here in Georgia. There goes another photographer I've been on several events with. He's got his, looks like, I don't know if he's going to that event or not over here that they're going to film in a moment. So anyway, that's it. That's the commentary that I can make on the situation. So that puts me in the position of not knowing when I'll make the jump to travel, because when I make that jump, I'm one to take the COVID-19 seriously. I think that public transit is a big risk, and I still think that social distancing is important. This is a global pandemic. This is not only a regional or national problem. This is a global problem. The U.S. State Department is officially at a level 4 do not travel warning advisory to American citizens. That is a global advisory from the U.S. State Department for all U.S. citizens that may consider travel internationally or travel abroad. And level 4 is do not travel unless you absolutely have to, unless it's a necessity. Don't travel. That's the current status. So with the news of record-breaking positives in the United States of COVID-19 and places like Texas and Florida with an overflow in ICU units with COVID-19 patients, etc., this is the problem. And it's not a time in the next couple of years, maybe 2 to 3 years, where I'm going to want to travel internationally. Unless it's necessary. So it's a big decision for me, because when I go back to the United States, I may not travel back to Georgia or to any other country for another 2 to 3 years, approximately. Because I look at public transport, that includes ships, trains, planes, etc., as a very high risk for possible infection of the new coronavirus, the COVID-19, regardless of the precautionary measures that they're using. Because while there are necessary and helpful preventive measures, there's no fully preventative measure unless you have a hazmat level 4, like biohazard suit that can protect you from a biological weapon, with a full-on separate air respirator and so on and so forth, and properly putting it on and taking it off and so on and so forth. So it really raises the risk to travel in public, with public transit and public transport. And so that's why, as an international traveler that spent 15 years expat style and tourist style with travel at least 1 to 6 times a year, I would say that for me, I'm really not at all sure once I make the trip over that I will be back within 2 to 3 years. I don't see how I would justify taking that type of risk, especially repeatedly during this very serious, heavy kind of global pandemic. Because once again, I was on the webinar today. We heard from experts on the political situation in regards to effects from COVID-19 on the Eastern Partnership nations. That's 6 different countries. And outside of Georgia here, Georgia has done the best in the region. But outside of Georgia, these other countries, it's from moderate to very serious. It's from moderate in Ukraine to Azerbaijan, for example, which we're told was very, very serious in Azerbaijan with COVID-19. It's a big problem right now, very serious problem. So that's it. The lights have come on in the park, and I think that's the end of what I wanted to talk about. About the NATO Center for Excellence being placed in Batumi, giving another NATO flag on Georgia. I think it makes perfect sense. We already have U.S. naval ships, I think French, maybe Spanish, Canadian. I think various NATO ships already coming in. America has as Luke Coffey shared in the webinar, they have defense obligations for NATO members, Bulgaria, and I can't remember if it's Hungary. So, you know, it's America's interests. And that was stated very clearly by Luke, former U.S. soldier with a bronze medal with the American Heritage Foundation. And yes, that's a conservative organization, and yes, they also, according to some news, are being censored, throttled, or deplatformed from Facebook. Something like this. So that's the risk and the punishment that I've taken by even publishing videos from conservatives that are presented on lectures here in Georgia. And I've published those films on YouTube and shared them to Facebook. That affects income. You get income from internet sales of any type, which in the past on eBay was, you know, for years. All that is dramatically affected when you have internet platforms, American big internet tech companies using algorithms to shadow ban, throttle, to block, to censor, to shadow block, to throttle. Based on if they've decided to take political bias against users content. With that said, it's a beautiful evening here. It's a beautiful park, perfect weather. Everybody seems to be in a fine, normal mood. It's a very beautiful scene and setting this late evening in Tbilisi. And I'll leave it to that, and hopefully soon I'll start talking about other topics absolutely unrelated to all of this, but there are some other webinars coming up, and I may choose to go on those if it's interesting. But I really do hope to distance myself from the whole political spectrum in the first place. I really don't have that kind of interest, except and when it's in front of my face. So when it's in the street, as it was last year, then it's a necessity to comment on. When it's against people in your own profession, your own associates that you've filmed with, photographed with, or done journalism with over the years, and it becomes a threat to them, then you have to, or a harm to them as it did, then you have to speak out on that. Otherwise, when it's out of sight, out of mind, and it's not people that you associate with, or that are your friends, or that are your associates, or people that you've even filmed, for example. But when it comes down to being a threat against you, or a threat against those, or a harm against those around you, then you have a tendency to speak, especially when it comes time to decide about an election. I'm not part of that. I didn't come here to be a part of that. So I just want to make that clear. I do have an International Relations Council Kansas City membership, and it's important to note that it's non-profit organization, the largest of its kind in the United States. And it's important to note that they strive to look at international relations. It's not a political party. That's something I wanted to state. Thanks for watching. This is Michael Vanderpool. Beautiful evening here in Tbilisi, the country of Georgia. Big decision as to whether I will travel and when. And with the COVID-19 pandemic and the U.S. State Department do not travel level 4 warning, although we still have the freedom and the right to travel when and where we want. That is an official advisement from the U.S. State Department to all American citizens who consider to travel abroad or internationally during this time in lieu of the global pandemic of COVID-19. It's just one of many indicators that when I travel back to the United States, I really seriously think it would be at least 2 to 3 years. It would be very difficult to see the logic, not the logistics, the logic. It would be very difficult to see the logic in taking that kind of risk until that is managed to where it is much, much lesser risk, if a risk at all, if that can even happen. Anyway, big decision, big topic, but I'm tired of talking about it, I'm tired of hearing about it, but I have to face it because it's a decision at one point or another I'll have to make, sooner or later. Thanks for watching.